Hi everybody. I want to talk to you about a time-tested way of storing meat. A way that's been used down through the centuries. You don't hear much about it today, but it was used in the past as far really probably as back as long as I don't know. I know in the 17th century and in the 18th century, America and Europe, this method of storing meat was used. And I think it's a valid option for today. And that's called, what's called salt pork. And I have a pig here in front of me. We butchered a pig, and I just want to show you what that looks like to do the process of storing your pork in a salt brine to keep it. So if you look back historically, on the ships, like when they would go out on the old wooden ships for months at a time, they would take meat with them, and they didn't have refrigeration, and so they would take salt pork with them. Or if a military was moving and they needed to take meat with them, they didn't have fresh meat necessarily, they would take salt pork with them. You can salt beef, that's a different subject, but we're talking about salt pork today. In fact, even Lewis and Clark, when they started out their westward expedition to go to the West Coast, they left several barrels of salt pork just near the Mississippi River. So when they got back to that point, they could dig those barrels up and they would have fresh pork because they knew that they would probably be low on meat. And so I think it's a really valid option if you don't have refrigeration, or if refrigeration would be a challenge to have. You could look at this option, store some salt pork. That's what I'm doing for my family. It worked then, and I think it can work today, and so we're just going to show you a little bit what that looks like. This is a piece of pork. I had a local butcher friend actually do the butchering for me. I didn't have time. And so he got me just the hanging pork, and my wife and I were wanting to make lard. So I'm taking the fat off right now, is what I'm doing. And you don't have to do this to do salt pork, but I want to do this because we're wanting to make lard, like I said. But what you need to do first of all is get your meat pieces cut up. Now, salt pork, when in the day when it was very popular, you could literally buy a whole barrel of salt pork, and it was a wood barrel in those days, and it would include, it wasn't like prime, it wasn't like a sirloin roast, it wasn't like your tenderloins, all the cuts you have today. It was actually just the pig being cut up, and a lot of times when you bought a barrel of salt pork, you even got the pork head, and you got the pork feet, and you got all the meat, because in those days it wasn't so much about the premium cuts, it was more about just meat, just having the protein to eat. And so with salt pork, I'm sure you could cut the tenderloins out, which I did that, and you can cut up roast. And these two this is a salt pork barrel I did, or jar, back March of 22, and this is one I did last night from some of this meat. And this is just taking the rump roast, and cutting it up into pieces, and then packing salt around it. And we'll display how that's done here, demonstrate how that's done. But what you want to do is you want to get your meat pieces that you're going to want to put in your salt pork. So I'm going down here, and it can be on any part of the pig. Another thing you could do if you don't raise pigs is go to Sam's or Costco and buy a box of pork, and then bring it home and cut it up and do your own salt pork. And then what you do is you just cut it into sizable pieces, just manageable pieces is really what you want to do. It's not too scientific. I'm not a butcher by no means, but you just cut it up into sizable pieces. You don't want huge chunks because you want to pack the salt around it. See here, I'm cutting them about an inch thick. That's what I'm doing. A little more fat than what I want in my salt pork, but I did take as much of that off as I want to take time doing. We still put pork in the freezer. I'm planning on curing some hams, doing a smoke curing on those, the hams back here. But I want to have the option that if the power goes out, if our freezers fail, something like that, we still have meat without being able maybe to go to the store and buying meat. We still have meat in storage. With the Lewis and Clark expedition, it was like 2 years their salt pork was stored in the ground as they put it there, and it was like another 2 years before they came back by and was able to harvest that. So history talks about salt pork. You know, you can store it for a year or two. You may we'll do another video on opening up the salt pork and what to expect. But very realistically, this is an option of storing pork for maybe up to 2 years at a time. So that is a really good option, and it doesn't require any special equipment or tools to do it. All it does is require cutting up the pork, having the pork, and then salt. And there's a brine that you make. We'll show that here in a few minutes. See, I'm not making just precision cuts here. Just wanting to get the meat manageable to get it put in the brine. Now, you can use different things. My wife and I, we've got several of these leftover 2-gallon jugs. We buy bulk items in, and we ended up with them. And so it's a great way to just reuse those for us. And then, but there's other options. In history, they would have used wood barrels. And that's, you know, I mean, we don't just have wood barrels readily available nowadays. I'm taking this meat off of here. Like I said, I'm not a butcher, no means. Just trying to save as much meat as possible. The rest will go to the dogs. One reason I did this pork this way is because I wanted to try doing this salt pork project again, and then I also wanted to try smoke curing pork also. So I knew that when I raised this pig and had it butchered, I'm probably not getting the maximum amount of meat harvested out of it like a professional butcher would. But I knew that in advance, so it was okay. So I got my pork right there, and now what I'll do is, now I see we can get a little more off of there. So I'm going to go ahead and try to do that. Get that pork off of there. What I'll do is I will get this cut, and then get my glass jar and show you what the next step is. So there's that. Here's my pork that I'm going to store in my glass jar. So I will get my glass jar and show you what the next step is. Okay, so we got our meat. We got a container to contain it. I'm using this old leftover pickle jar that we have. You need some hot water. You need salt and an egg and something to mix with, and your meat. That's all you need. So no, it doesn't take a lot of stuff, but I bought this at Gordon Food Stores. This is a Cargill high grade itemized granulate salt, and I think that is how many pounds? I think it's 25 pounds of salt, and we just keep some of that on hand. It's so important to be able to use salt. Salt's used so much in preservation and things. So you want to make a brine to pour in around the meat. So what I want to do is I'm going to pour salt into my hot water, and I'm going to start stirring it. And what I want to do is I want to make the old recipes from the 18th century, when they were doing this all the time, said make your brine so stiff that an egg will float. And so you don't need a lot of water. It depends on the size of container you're going to use. Last night when we was doing it, my daughter filled this up clear full, and we didn't even use near half of that to fill in around the meat. So you don't need a lot of water necessarily. It just kind of depends on the size of your container. Now I'm going to start getting some salt dissolving in that hot water, and I will stir that occasionally. And then also what I want to do is I want to put some salt in my container. Put some in the bottom, just kind of cover the bottom like so. And then what you want to do is you want to take your pork, your meat, and start putting it in your jar or in your container and layering it. That's the key, is layer it as much as you can in the salt. And as you get a layer, kind of pack it in, and then as you get a layer, get your salt and put a layer of salt on top of that. So that's what I'm going to do next. Just kind of put a layer of salt on top of that layer of meat. And then go back and get some more pork. And do this all again. And kind of the key is like I said, to try to pack it in there, layer it in there the best you can. And then get a dose of salt, and that's what we're going to do. We're just going to continue putting a layer of salt between each of these layers of meat. You can see there how we're doing that. It's not real complicated. Just keep that process up until you fill your container, regardless of the size of your container. That's what you want to do. It's interesting, salt pork used to be a publicly traded commodity. So there was laws regarding salt pork in history in the American colonies. It was regulated, regulated not by necessarily food safety, but by weight. And even certain states had certain kind of regulations on if you brought your salt pork from, let's say, from Virginia. It was put together in Virginia or packed in Virginia. The barrels had to be marked, a product of Virginia, because they were proud of their salt pork, so to speak, or they wanted to make sure that if there was some kind of shystering, something happening where maybe the barrel wasn't full or something like that, they could go back and say, hey, the salt pork in Virginia is not the most credible people handling that. And so you have that dynamic. Now I will mention that when you take this out, and we'll do another video on utilizing salt pork, when you're going to take it out of here, it is going to be really salty. And so what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to soak it in water for a little bit and try to get as much salt out of it as you can. But as you can see, the salt is doing the preserving. It's what's doing the preserving. And salt's an excellent ancient preservative that's been used down through the ages. Looks like I'm going to need a little bit more meat to finish out this jar. Looks like I'm just a little bit short. Now I think I'm going to cut this off. That is kind of a dry piece. Another thing I think is really fascinating is, as much as I appreciate the United States Department of Agriculture and the food safety people, I really think, as I look back through history, which I enjoy history very much, as I look back through history, there's a lot of things that historically was done that the food safety people, the safety industry, let me put it that way, just really frown on today. And I just think it's interesting. You know, we need to use wisdom. We want to use wisdom in food safety. Nobody wants to get sick. I don't want to get sick either. But also, I'm not naive enough to realize that regulations sometimes are used to pad the pockets of those that benefit from it. And that's one reason we're a part of the homestead movement, is because we want to be able to do a few things on our own that can be used to take care of our own family. We're just and I respect that. That's how we operate as a family, and I think that's why other people are so interested in some of these techniques, is because we're like, you know what? Our food, American food, is very fragile. And the grocery store literally could go away. The stuff on the shelves could go away pretty quick. And we've seen that in the past. Okay, so there you see, I've got a fairly full jar of pork. And I'm going to finish off by putting some more salt in. Kind of filling that up. You can see here, go liberal with your salt. It won't hurt anything. In fact, it really kind of helps things. And I got my brine here going. Let's see how we're doing on floating an egg. Hey, looky there. We're floating an egg. So, according to the 18th century cookbooks, that's what was the one thing you wanted to do. Get your salt brine so salty that it can float an egg. So we've got that done. So now what you do is you take your brine and you just start pouring it in. And you let that moisture, that salty water, that salt brine, filter in, and you can see how it's starting to run down in your jar and soaking up that salt. And just like you can see in the one I done here last night, it's got the liquid in it, and the salt is all moved around. And even the one that was done a year ago, you know, a lot of the salt settled in the bottom, but you can tell that is a very salty solution, and that's what you want. One thing I've noticed is give it a little bit of time to percolate down. What I generally do is put the salt brine in and kind of keep it filled up here like I am now. And then I may go do something else for 20-30 minutes and come back and just top it off if it needs topped off a little bit. This one here I done last night. You can see I really ought to top that off a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Top that off, just bring it up. And seal that back up. I got another one we did last night, you can see, and it settled just a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and put a little more brine water in that. And I'll just watch that. It shouldn't need refilled again. It shouldn't need topped off another time. But later tonight, I will come back here and I will check this. I will let this set, and then I'll come back and top it off with my brine water. But that's it, folks. It's very easy. And you can see how it's something that anybody can do at home. If you got some salt, you have hot water, you have a container, you have your pork. Now, I will mention salt beef. Salt beef does not, you can do this with beef also, but history says, if you read historical accounts, it turns hard, kind of like a brick, the beef does. And you have to soak it in water a long time or chew kind of gnaw on it, but that's another subject. The salt pork, when we take it out, it's still very amiable, and it'll still need cooked. It's not like you can get by without cooking it. It's still going to need cooked, but at least it's going to be preserved. So I hope this helps out, gives you another option in your food preservation. Just like I said before, we keep pork in the freezer. My wife tries to can some pork. You know, I want to try smoking. That's another option. But I want to have, you know, 2 or 3 options I can fall back on. And I kind of look at that way even with My old Jeep sitting right here beside me, my old Willys Jeep, it's got a carburetor in it. It don't have any electronics. It's bare bones. It will, if electronics fail, I've got another option. And so that's how I approach homesteading, is I want to have 2 or 3 options available. If one fails, I've got a backup plan. So anyhow, until we get back together, I hope you have a good evening.